Today we're catching some sun and waves with Michele, a QHS member whose life is as vibrant and refreshing as a seaside breeze. What currents brought her to the sunny shores of the quantum shift? Let's surf behind the scenes to see the waves she's been riding.
I'm Michele, and here's my backstory. So I grew up in a town outside of Philadelphia, middle-class home. Family dinner, 5 o'clock every night, kids in the backyard to play with, pretty typical. However, I wasn't typical. Even from an early age, I was incredibly hypermobile. I could put my hand all the way down my back. I could bend over and palm things. So I was always incredibly flexible, hypermobile. So I always thought that was a nice trick when I was younger. Later, you'll hear that wasn't so good. Did well in school, absolutely loved school. It was my favorite thing. I used to read books. I even worked at the library so I could get more books. Used to climb up in trees and read. They were sort of my comfort, and I was always fascinated with all the things you could learn. So growing up, pretty typical, except I was really bored in school. Not to brag, but I was like a lot smarter than almost everybody else in there. So even at like second grade, they started giving me fifth grade books. By high school, I was taking college classes. I ended up graduating college at 19, graduate school at 22, had my doctorate degree. So a little bit of an overachiever. My family was pretty normal. My mom, my dad, they celebrated their 70th wedding anniversary before my dad died. My grandmom lived with us. She was Armenian, and oh my goodness, what a great cook she was. So we always had wonderful homemade family dinners. 5 o'clock, everybody had to be home and sitting down because that was what we did. Holidays were always fun, regular Christmases, you name the holiday and we celebrated it. So that was all pretty good. However, I was sick a lot. If I got a cold, it always turned into more. The doctor at the time said I was just allergic to my own mucus. And then my immune system would kick into turbo gear. And so I was always taking antibiotics. At camp, my nickname was penicillin. So again, I was pretty much sick. If I had something, it took me longer to recover. Incredibly sensitive to sounds. I could hear somebody talking about me 3 rooms away. I could smell smoke. I could smell mold. Incredibly hypersensitive to all that stuff. So I had to wear muffs on my ears a lot to block out noise. So that was always a challenge. Jumping ahead, I went to college early, as I said, met my husband. We got married the week after graduation. So I was married at 19. In May, we get to celebrate our 50th anniversary. So he was a keeper. So that was nice. College, loved college. Again, overachiever. I overloaded, took extra classes so that I could graduate quickly. Always in a hurry. But I was also athletic back then. I was playing on the tennis team, played on the volleyball team, was a lifeguard. But again, I would dislocate my shoulder a lot. It would pop out. If I did a serve, my shoulder would like pop out and I'd pop it back in place. So different body parts would move around and I would always just put them back when I was younger. So moving ahead, my husband went with me to grad school. We went to Mississippi and then to Georgia, so we always moved around a lot. I had my first son. That was pretty easy. Natural childbirth, popped him out, was wanting food like 20 minutes later because I hadn't eaten in forever. I thought this was great. We were going to have like 4 kids, 5 kids. It was nice. Moving ahead, my second kid, not so easy. I almost died in childbirth. He almost died. It turned out I ripped ligaments in my stomach while I was pregnant. The doctors didn't believe me at the time, but I felt them pop. I got a book out and I saw what had popped where. And sure enough, when they did do the C-section, it was I had ripped 3 ligaments. just from carrying him, which was unusual, but unusual sort of my story. For my second child, unfortunately, I ended up with an emergency C-section, and they didn't have time to do anesthesia, so they actually ended up slicing me without anesthesia. So that was quite traumatic. And my son had only less than a 10% chance to live, so he was in the neonatology unit because I had had an infection and it had passed on to him. So even though it was rare, that was that. But my son lived, I lived. We decided no more kids, though. Almost dying and having a C-section without anesthesia was not something I ever wanted to experience again. And after that, I started having more and more problems. Up until then, I was pretty healthy, pretty active, loving life pretty much. It was pretty nice. My husband and I played tennis on couples teams. I went to Zumba and aerobics and had tons of energy, and things were good. So we continued our family traditions. We had lots of parties, lots of get-togethers. Our house was always the party house. I used to have 8 different sets of dishes. I had my fancy dishes for each season and my casual dishes for each season. And if somebody came to my house and I didn't have the dishes changed out, they knew I wasn't feeling well. They would come and say, "It's spring, you still have the winter dishes." So that was sort of fun, though, but I used to enjoy doing all that. So career-wise, again, super achiever. Ended up in private practice. Well, first I tried teaching. I majored in English and journalism, as well as psychology. And so I tried teaching English. And my first group was 6th graders. I quit my first day. I quit my second day. I quit my third day. So the principal finally said, "Okay, I guess you're serious. You really don't want to do this." And so he said, "I have a behavior disturbed class that you might be better suited for." So instead of having 30 behavior disturbed kids, I only had 5, and there were 3 of us against 5 of them. And I loved it. I love psychology. I loved helping people change their behavior. Just dealing with it in mass was a little bit too much for me. So I taught the behavior disturbed kids, who I thought were absolutely lovely. And I really enjoyed that. Later on, I ended up in private practice as a counseling psychologist. So when I graduated, I was fortunate enough to get an APA-approved internship, one of the few in the country, of course. Was one of the youngest people working in the place where I was. And I loved it. I loved counseling. My motivation was probably the Bob Newhart show. I don't know how many people still remember that, but I loved the fact that he got paid for sitting around talking to people and helping them. That looked like an ideal job to me. So I was a psychologist for a while, seeing people, and that was nice. I got to go from there to being a college professor. I was at a Christian college and I taught graduate counseling students. Developed an internship program for them, did a lot of training, mentoring, and that felt good. And at the time, I also ended up writing some books. My grandmom, who had lived with me, survived the Armenian genocide. She was a child at the time, and she was on the death march, they called it, where they had to leave their country and people were just killed at each spot. And so anyhow, by the time my grandmom ended up in our country, she was really mad at God, and she would say there is no God. So anyhow, she passed away after making up with God on her deathbed, and she asked me to write her story so maybe other people wouldn't wait so long. So I wrote a book. I called it Making Up with God. The publishers called it Angry with God. They thought people would like that better. So it came out actually right before 9/11, and the publisher had given 5,000 copies out at Ground Zero, and that started a media blitz. So I used to go around doing speaking engagements, helping to sort of encourage people who feel like they're left out, left alone, and nobody's there, and encouraging them that God's always there. We don't always see him. We don't always know how he's working, but he's always there. So that was the first book I wrote, Angry with God. And then my son Jared, who actually tore the ligaments in my stomach for being so active, was diagnosed with ADHD. I always said it was ADRRRHD, attention deficit, really hyperactive disorder. He had a rap sheet at the hospital before he was 2. He already covered the whole front page and was on the back page. He would do things like jump out the window, grab a can of off and spray it in his eyes. He was always getting hurt and injured. We ended up with a leash, and back in the 80s, you were really frowned upon if you had your kid on a leash, but we couldn't catch Jared or keep an eye on him sometimes without it. So anyhow, I ended up with a second career in the ADHD world, and I wrote one of the books on adult ADHD, because at the time they said it didn't exist. This is back in the 80s. They said it was a childhood issue. And I had adults who were forgetting to pick up their kids, forgetting to bring checks, being late, fired from work. And I did look at my father, who was never lived up to his potential. He was super duper smart, didn't finish things, didn't follow up on things. So he always ended up underemployed and frustrated. I still remember one time he came home, he worked on the shipyard, but he was a draftsman, just copying designs tediously, and he hated that. And so one time he was copying the design, and he told the guys, "This isn't going to work." And they're like, "We have engineers, don't worry about it. Your job is just to copy it." And my dad didn't have the best social skills, which is why I wrote a book on social skills later. But yeah, so dad's like telling them it's not going to work. You can do whatever you want. So anyhow, they end up building the Navy ship, and the part that he said wasn't going to work didn't work. And he was a very humble man. So of course he told everybody, "I told you so." And anyhow, they said, "That's okay. We have consultants. They're going to do this." And he's like, "That's not going to work." So anyhow, they end up, fast forward, the ship's due. There's like this huge penalty. I don't know, it might have been like $100,000 a day back then or something big if the ship didn't go out. So finally, in desperation, they said, "All right, Bill, do you think you really can fix the Navy ship?" He's like, "Damn straight I can." So he came to home, and he was never home early. Again, it was always 5 o'clock when we had dinner. And it was like 3 o'clock or something. And my mom's like, "What are you doing home?" And he said, "I have to fix a Navy ship." And he got a grocery bag, and he picked up the vacuum cleaner. And my dad never touched a vacuum cleaner because it was a traditional middle class family. My mom did all the house stuff. And so my dad's holding this vacuum cleaner proudly, saying he's going to fix the ship. And he took something out of our vacuum cleaner, went downstairs, took something out of the washing machine. So he ran around the house collecting stuff in this Acme grocery bag. And he ended up going on the ship. And of course, they were laughing like crazy. My dad fixed the Navy ship with part of a vacuum cleaner, part of a washing machine, and a couple other things. It was funny. In fact, one time I was speaking in Philly, and my dad, that was his like proudest moment. His ADD, out of the box thinking, actually worked. And so I was telling the story, and this guy raised his hand, and he said, "My dad was one of the engineers on that ship project. You should have heard our dinner conversations about your father." So anyhow, I learned to respect the fact that people can think divergently, and it's not always bad. Not finishing things has problems. So my career took a little turn to helping individuals with adult ADHD or adult ADHD tendencies learn how to have structure, strategy, support, scaffolding to be successful. So I really enjoyed that. Wrote a book on social skills that not only my dad needed, but others. Breaking them down, because again, I'm a behavioral psychologist at heart, and I love looking at the pieces of things. So some things come naturally to people, and some people need help figuring things out. So I wrote a pretty practical guide on social skills, and that was really pretty helpful too. I became the CEO of the national nonprofit because the ADD organization at the time was a renegade organization, because again, legitimately only kids could have it. So if you were a psychologist or psychiatrist trying to help individuals with something that didn't exist, it was a problem. So I spearheaded the ADHD Association back in the day. And actually, we lobbied the American Psychological Association, Psychiatric Association, and got them to finally acknowledge the existence of adults with ADHD. I even helped write a U.S. Senate resolution for the first ADHD Awareness Day. That was awful too, though, because the national big organizations got credit for it later because they ended up not wanting to put it out with just our name. So we had to give them credit too. But I'm good at collaborating, so we decided it was more important to get it out than have our name. I think we did get our name first, though. So I've spent a career helping people. The ADHD organization was great, but they weren't good at strategic planning. They weren't good at finances. So I found ways to help them come up with plans. And that was really incredibly fulfilling. So I really enjoyed that. Did a lot of mentoring. After that, I ended up with a pharmaceutical company. And it was interesting, though, because I ended up helping them with their non-medication strategies. So whereas our organization had, I don't know, maybe $200,000 a year to spend, I would have individual projects that had more than that, all on the different behavioral strategies, all the non-medication things to do to help. So the first website I worked with in collaboration with the pharma company won Website of the Year and for consumer products. So that was really fun. So while I was there, I also set up the first scholarship for individuals with ADHD to go to college. And then the pharma people wanted to have a project to do good. So they took over my little scholarship and they turned it into giving 50 students scholarships each year. And then I asked them if they'd also include coaching, because getting there is part of the journey, staying there is the other part. And they did that too. I also worked with some people coming up with standards for the first coaching associations, helping individuals with ADHD. So we ended up with certification programs because a lot of people thought they were helping, but their help wasn't help. They were telling people what to do instead of working them through the process. So we ended up with a curriculum for coaching. So all this time I was doing wonderful things career-wise. That part's been great. However, my body, after my son was born with that traumatic birth, several months later, I ended up in a car accident. And it was a minor one. I was only like 40 miles an hour, whatever. I was hit from behind and ended up with terrible whiplash. Couldn't move. My mouth ended up like lockjawed. I couldn't open my mouth. And everybody was thinking I was just doing it to milk the insurance companies or whatever. But I was really injured, a lot of pain. So that was on a December 9th. I was hit again January 9th from behind at a stop sign. Again, this one was really bad. I ended up with a Philadelphia collar, back pain, neck pain, all sorts of pains, couldn't hardly move. I stayed home February 9th. Not that I'm usually suspicious, but why tempt it? Was hit the first thing the morning of the 10th of February. So I had 3 accidents in a row. My body just went through all sorts of hell and havoc. I ended up with multiple surgeries. I was one of the first to have a bilateral TMJ surgery. So one of the guys that developed the technique actually did my surgery because I couldn't open my mouth. The pain was the worst I've ever had. I ended up thinking that if I wasn't alive, it wouldn't be that bad because at least the pain would stop. And then I was thinking how I would actually do it. And then I'm thinking, I'm a psychologist. I know this isn't good. It's one thing to think about dying. It's another thing to actually think about methods. That's not good. So I knew the pain had to stop because that was just intolerable. So I ended up with the surgeries and that helped that. But then I ended up with, at the same time, I had torn my rotator cuff on both shoulders. So I ended up with 2 shoulder surgeries. Both my knees, I had ripped ligaments, needed surgeries. I had neuropathy. My left leg was numb. I ended up stepping on my foot and breaking my foot without knowing it was there. So I've had, I think it's like 26 surgeries from different ligament tears. So I was always ripping something somehow. Even on the elliptical, twice I ripped my knee on the elliptical. I've had incredible back pain, neck pain. It was so bad that I couldn't ride sitting up in a car. We ended up buying a van so I could lay down to transport me. Traditional medicine gave up on me a long time ago. Back in the early 90s, before I even had my whole wonderful career, they had told me I was permanently disabled. I should just stay home, and there's nothing they could do for me, and just give it up. I always said, if somebody says it can't be done, they need to get out of the way of those that are going to do it. I just refused that. Later on, I did see my reports, and they had said patient in denial. But anyhow, so they had just given me drugs to numb the pain. And so I started into what was then like risque, was chiropractic care. I found acupuncturists. So you name the crazy thing, I was doing it. I used to wear braces all the time. So I spent a lot of my career just going, because I would do a lot of speaking and things. And I was always in neck braces, back braces, elbow braces. I'd always patch everything up. But nobody knew why I was hurting. They said there's no reason for me to hurt. And they couldn't quite explain why I would rip myself all the time. So I had a condition that nobody seemed to pay any attention to, but was really pretty debilitating. But other than that, I sort of lived my best life in between the moments when I was okay enough. So I got to enjoy my kids growing up, going off to college. Really enjoyed them going off to college finally, especially my hyperactive guy. He was a handful. So my younger son had a lot of the ADHD, so he was always a challenge. So he and my father got along really well. They both were sort of way out of the box. Luckily now my son's employed for an IT company, big computer company, and he's their go-to to solve problems that nobody else can figure out. So he hasn't pulled out a grocery bag full of things, but he's got some other tricks up his sleeve. So anyhow, just sort of a pretty typical everything in between, except for all the different challenges medically. They've taken up a lot of my time. And I was doing all right enough, and then I had a fall. I was running to catch the phone, and I had socks on, and the cleaning people had cleaned the floor. I fell really hard and hit the front head of my head on the wooden floor and the back head on an oak chest behind me. My younger son was with me at the time, and I couldn't breathe. Was out for a little bit of a concussion. After that moment, that closed head trauma, I got to where I couldn't remember the names of my clients. I used to have an incredible memory. I wouldn't remember their stories. Sometimes I would go in the office and I would look and just sort of see who came with me, and I guess they were my client. And I realized that I shouldn't be a psychologist right now. I wasn't okay enough, so I had to quit my career as a psychologist and just sort of focus on trying to put the pieces together. Unfortunately, I ended up with a lot of chronic fatigue syndrome. Really, really bad. I would get exhausted most of the time. We had gone on a trip to Hawaii, and I'd gotten bit by something about that time. I thought it was Lyme's disease. I tested negative for it, but after that, my sleeping was incredibly disturbed, a lot of brain fog. They identified a heart murmur that they hadn't seen before with mitral valve prolapse. I also have scoliosis too, which ended up with uneven hips, which ended up contributing to back things. Talk about Humpty Dumpty. So I spent a lot of time trying to recover from the head trauma incident, and this one really took me for a loop. It was pretty bad. Fortunately, my husband picked up a lot of the slack, and we were able to have a lot of college kids come and help. We ended up moving to the villages in Florida, which was a lot of fun, and life was easier, and I started doing much better. And I ended up bumping my head on a Disneyland bus, and I ended up with a dent in my head. It was 2 fingers long and 2 fingers deep, so you actually could lay your fingers right in the dent in my head. It didn't hurt at the time, and I thought that was unusual that my head had caved in. But then I ended up with a lot of head trauma kind of symptoms. So again, real profound difficulties. I couldn't add numbers. I couldn't even figure out tip things. I couldn't get from place to place. And then I ended up, I realized too, I damaged my prefrontal cortex, which is what happens with ADHD. That's the part that does all the organizing and planning. So I found myself using a lot of the strategies I used to tell other people just to get through. But it was really scary. My husband had said he thought he lost me at that point in time. But he started researching things. Usually I was the researcher. But he started researching head dents. So there was a lot on head dents in kids, but not on adults. He finally came across an obscure reference to cranial sacral therapy, and he found that in Chicago, and there were a couple therapists. And so we were getting ready to go up to Chicago. And then luckily in one of my few moments of time, I found we had a cranial sacral therapist like 15 minutes from us in Florida where we were. So she looked at my head dent and I said, "Is this something you could work on?" She said, "Well, I've never seen one like this, but sure." So she thought it would be about 3 sessions or so. Well, about 3 years later, finally my head is healed up, and along with it, I've started getting back a lot more of my mental functioning. So that's been a real lifesaver for me. So again, I've always been on the crazy end of stuff. I did myofascial release before people even knew who John Barnes was out in Paoli where we were. And so I did the cranial sacral therapy, and that started helping a lot with the pain, but I still always had chronic neck pain, back pain, and hypermobile joints. And I couldn't understand for the life of me why I would rip things doing normal activities. So I finally, I would talk to doctors and they would just shrug me off. And finally, after I ripped my knee for the 3rd time and needed my 3rd knee surgery, it's like, okay, this just isn't right. You're not supposed to rip a knee on the lowest setting of an elliptical machine. And so I started researching, and I came across a connective tissue disorder. It turns out there's something called Ehlers-Danlos, which is a connective tissue disorder. And I was finally diagnosed with that. And that's why everything's ripping. So genetically, my body seems to think that collagen is bad. And so it scoots it right out. And so as I was younger, sort of looking back, I had enough of it. But as you get older, it keeps on less and less and less and less. I've seen pictures of my connective tissue when they've done ultrasounds, and some of it just looked like shredded paper with holes in it. It was really pretty scary. I know the one guy, when he'd operated on my elbow, had said, "I've never seen anything like this." I wasn't even sure what or how I could put something together. So when I realized what I had, and that I was basically held together with tissue paper with holes in it, I decided I wasn't going to move. So I stopped all my exercising. I stopped doing almost everything until I could figure out. Again, they said there's no way you can regrow collagen. There's no way you can change a genetic disorder. Just live with it. And I'm like, no. It's like there has to be some way to change my wiring, to do something so that my body could learn that collagen is not the enemy. And it doesn't need to get into hyperdrive anytime I get a cold and get all crazy. So I started venturing into like some of the different nutritional supplements. And again, unfortunately with this, if you take collagen, it's just more stuff your body has to kick out. So that's not the answer. I started doing like PRP injections. I even did stem cells. I thought if my cells don't know what to do with collagen, maybe somebody else's cells can help my cell learn what to do with collagen. I've done sessions where I've talked to my cells and told them that it's okay. Collagen's really good. We need this. If you don't want collagen, tell me what else you could use that could help build things. So I've gone on some renegade websites and found some different protocols. So I've been doing like aloe and some different things like that. But I still wasn't quite confident that my body was going to stay in place. Like if I get a chiropractor adjustment, I'm usually out within a day or two, if not the same day, because everything's just hypermobile. Fast forward to now, I've ended up with blue light therapy. Fortunately, we have a blue room, one of the only in the country, right near us where we move now. So that seemed to have been helpful. And the person there had told us about QHS and the V6s, and so I'm all in. And what's interesting is since they've scanned me recently, the same elbow that looked like tissue paper doesn't look like tissue paper. It sort of looks like a normal ligament in my elbow. So I don't know, I'm getting encouraged. I actually took a little walk it's only a block and a half, but I started moving. So I'm really encouraged and hopeful for all that's ahead. So looking forward to some of the changes, but I think my body's finally learned that it can do something with this, and that it doesn't need to go crazy with all my autoimmune stuff every time something happens. It was funny in prepping for this, I had sort of looked through some old medical records, and I mean, my one list of symptoms was like 2 pages deep. I also am super sensitive to cold, to hot. I get super cold when it's cold, super hot when it's hot. I didn't used to ever sweat, never sweated, which isn't good. Even in Florida, I didn't sweat. So now I'm seeing all sorts of changes starting to happen. Sleep is big, so sleep is much better, which is amazing, because I know your body heals when it sleeps. So that's been big. I finally sweat. I was so excited one day. My husband told me my arms stank, and I went, yes. So it's like, good job, good job. So I'm really amazed at the changes my body is able to make, and the fact that it's kept me going this long under such severe kind of just everything that I've been through. So lots of trauma. But even when I'm down and out, I still mentor some people. So one of the things I found is I always can talk on the phone when I'm laying down, and I would like to have more functional time. I only have little blocks of time where I'm able to do stuff, and then I have to recover, and then I lay down and rest a lot. But I've learned to listen to my body. I fought my body for probably 15 years, making it go when it wanted me to stop. And I've learned that that's my body telling me what it needs. So I'm learning to work with my body. I'm almost 70, so I guess you can teach an old dog some new tricks. And I'm just looking forward to being functional again and being able to help people do things again. And we'll see, celebrating our 50th wedding anniversary, which should be fun. Got 2 lovely grandkids. They're adorable. One of them probably has ADHD. She's incredibly hyperactive, and she's adorable. So again, love spending time with them. Hope I can get back to ballroom dancing again. I did one swing dance and ended up on the couch for 2 days because my knee hurt, but it didn't go out. It didn't go out, and I didn't rip anything. So I guess that's progress. So that's where I am now.
Join us on the Prequel, where every story matters and every voice is heard. Because here at QHS, we're all about healing, learning, and growing together.